The storm arrived on a Tuesday, the way all bad things arrive in small villages, without warning and with no intention of leaving quickly. Porto Sereno sat along the Amalfi Coast like a secret someone had carved into the cliffside. 43 houses, a church with a leaning bell tower, a harbour of fishing boats that clattered against their moorings like nervous teeth. It was October of 1962, and the Mediterranean had turned the colour of hammered iron. Rain came in curtains across the terracotta rooftops, flooding the narrow lanes, filling the stone gutters until they sang. The fishermen had pulled their boats in 2 days ago and retreated to their kitchens and their silences. The olive trees bent, the sea rose, and somewhere beneath the oldest house on the hill, a wine cellar was filling with water no one had yet noticed. Enzo Ferrara had owned this village for 40 years without ever once purchasing it outright. He had simply made himself indispensable, then inevitable. His boats carried the catch. His money had rebuilt the harbour wall after the storm of 1951. His signature was on half the mortgages in the village and most of the fishing licenses along this stretch of coast. He was 77 years old and had no plans to die. His 3 children had gathered for the storm, as they always did. Marco with his gambling debts, Lucia with her suitcases always half-packed, Tommaso with his quiet hands and his quieter resentments. They ate dinner together that evening, the 4 of them, beneath the painting of the Madonna, passing wine in near silence. Enzo told his youngest son, Tommaso, over the soup that he would never sell his inheritance, that the answer was no, that it had always been no. He said it the way only fathers say things, as though the conversation were already over. It was the last meal Enzo Ferrara would ever eat. It was Lucia who found him. She had gone down for another bottle of wine at 10:30. The cellar stairs were in the back of the kitchen, behind a heavy oak door, and she opened it to find 8 inches of dark water on the stone floor and her father floating face down among the wine racks, his wool coat fanned out around him like a great black flower. She did not scream immediately. That detail would matter later. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, Lucia Ferrara, 38 years old, and she looked at the body of her father. And then she called for her brothers in a voice that was very controlled. The storm hammered the windows. By the time Marco and Tommaso carried Enzo's body to the kitchen floor, the village doctor had been roused and was making his way through the flooded lanes with a lantern. He would be the first to notice what the water in the cellar could not explain. Enzo Ferrara had not drowned in rainwater. The salt on his lips was from the sea. By midnight, the telephone lines were down. The road over the cliff had flooded at the 3rd turn, and no vehicle could pass in either direction. Porto Sereno was an island now, in all but name. The local carabiniere, a young man of 26 named Russo, who had never investigated a death more complicated than a drowning at sea, sent a message by the only means available. A fisherman's boy on a bicycle, along the cliff path in the rain. Inspector Vitale De Luca of Salerno arrived the following morning by boat, the only way in. He stepped onto the dock in a dark overcoat that was immediately soaked, looked up at the white houses climbing the cliff face, and lit a cigarette. The body had been kept in the cold cellar, which was still half flooded. The suspects, all of them, were still in the village. There was nowhere to go. De Luca walked the length of the dock slowly, taking in the boats, the shuttered windows, the eyes watching him from behind wet glass. He had the particular calm of a man who already understood that the answer was here, and that it was only a matter of asking the right questions in the right order. De Luca interviewed them one by one in the front room of the Ferrara house, beneath that same Madonna painting, the rain making white noise against the shutters. Marco was defensive before he'd been accused of anything. A gambler's reflex, De Luca noted, the instinct to deny having lost even before the cards are shown. He admitted the debts. He admitted his father had refused to advance him against his inheritance. He had been in the village square at 9 o'clock the previous evening, he said, at the taverna with witnesses. Lucia was composed to the point of coldness. She answered every question precisely and offered nothing additional. She had gone to bed at 9, she said. Alone. She had no alibi and seemed unbothered by the fact. The priest, Padre Aureliano, arrived without being summoned. He sat across from De Luca with his rosary wound around his fingers and said very little, which told De Luca quite a lot. And Silvio Cataldo, the old rival, came in from the rain with mud on his boots and a look on his face that was halfway between grief and something that was not grief at all. The doctor's report was plain in its implications and troubling in its details. Enzo Ferrara had seawater in his lungs, not the brackish diluted water of a flooded cellar, but open Mediterranean seawater, dense with salt, the kind that exists only in the harbour and beyond it. He had been drowned somewhere else and moved. The cellar flooding had been a convenience, not a cause. De Luca spent an hour in the cellar with a lantern, moving through the knee-deep water slowly, reading the room. He found 3 things of interest. First, the small iron drain at the base of the cellar wall had been wedged open with a cork, deliberately to allow water in from the storm channel that ran beneath the house. Second, Enzo's boots were missing. A man does not go to his own cellar without shoes. Third, and most quietly significant, on the wine rack nearest the stairs, someone had disturbed the dust along a particular shelf. A bottle had been moved and replaced. Not taken, just moved. De Luca pulled the bottle out, turned it over. Behind it, pressed flat against the stone, was a small folded piece of paper. He did not open it yet. He put it in his coat pocket and went back upstairs to ask more questions. It was the woman from Rome who attracted the most suspicion in those first hours, and deliberately so, though De Luca would not understand that until later. Giulia Romano had been seen at the harbour the evening of the murder in the rain, speaking to Enzo Ferrara. 2 fishermen confirmed it independently. She had a leather notebook filled with names and dates and references to land registry documents. When De Luca interviewed her, she was frank about almost everything. She was a journalist, she told him, investigating illegal land acquisitions along the Amalfi Coast, and Enzo Ferrara had been the central figure in her investigation. He had, she said, agreed to speak with her formally. He had information he wished to share. He had used that exact phrase, information he wished to share. She had gone to meet him at the harbour at 8 o'clock. They had spoken for perhaps 20 minutes. He had been alive and well when she left him. But the notebook, when De Luca finally examined it closely, contained a single line underlined 3 times, circled in red ink, in what was clearly a different handwriting than the surrounding notes. It read, "Ask about the youngest son." De Luca found Padre Aureliano in the church at Vespers, alone, kneeling before the altar with the candles burning low and the rain hammering the old roof. He sat in the pew beside him without speaking for a long moment, which was a technique he had used for 30 years. Eventually the priest spoke first, as they always did. He could not reveal what was said in confession, he said. This De Luca already knew, but he could confirm that Enzo Ferrara had come to him 3 days before his death, and that whatever had passed between them had left the old patriarch unsettled in a way Padre Aureliano had never witnessed in 40 years of knowing the man. Enzo had been afraid, not of death. Old fishermen make their peace with death early, but of something specific, something that lived in his own house. The priest's hands trembled slightly as he said this, and De Luca noted without comment the mud on the priest's sandals. Fresh mud, harbour mud, the dark silty kind that clings to the dock pilings. The priest had been at the harbour recently, perhaps the night before. He had not mentioned this. De Luca filed it away and thanked him and walked back out into the rain. Silvio Cataldo, he had just learned from the carabiniere, had been seen outside the Ferrara house at 11 o'clock the previous evening, with a lantern, looking at the cellar window. De Luca called them all together at 7 o'clock that evening, in the Ferrara sitting room, with the storm still going and the lamps burning low on olive oil. They sat in a rough semicircle, Marco with his arms folded and his jaw tight, Lucia perfectly still with her hands in her lap, Tommaso in the corner chair, almost invisible, watching nothing in particular with great attention. The priest stood near the door. Silvio Cataldo sat with his hat in his hands, turning it. Giulia Romano stood apart, notebook closed. De Luca stood at the fireplace, which had gone cold. He began not with accusations, but with facts, which he laid out one by one, like stones across a stream. The seawater in the lungs, the wedged drain, the missing boots, the disturbed wine shelf, the paper he had found behind the bottle, which he now held up, unfolded so they could all see it. A promissory note, dated 3 years prior, signed by Tommaso Ferrara and countersigned by his father, transferring the youngest son's full inheritance to Enzo outright, in exchange for a debt already paid. Enzo had not refused to release Tommaso's inheritance. Enzo had already taken it. And everyone in this room, De Luca said quietly, had known except Tommaso. Until 3 days ago. Tommaso Ferrara did not run. He did not deny it. He sat in the corner chair with his calloused fisherman's hands folded in his lap, and he looked at De Luca with the steady eyes of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has simply set it down. He had found out 3 days ago, he said. Giulia Romano had shown him the property records. She hadn't meant to destroy him with the information. She had thought he already knew. He had gone to his father that night, at the harbour where Enzo went every evening, regardless of weather, to check the boats. They had argued. His father had laughed at him. That was the detail Tommaso returned to again and again. His father had laughed. And so he had held him under, in the harbour, in the seawater. Not for very long. His father was 77 years old and had not fought hard. Then he had carried him, this man who had taken everything from him, back to the house, through the lanes, in the rain, which was already heavy enough that no one saw. He had put him in the cellar, which was already beginning to flood. He had wedged the drain open to make sure the water rose. He had gone to bed. He had slept. That last part, De Luca would later say, was the most chilling thing he had ever heard in 30 years of police work. Not the murder, the sleep. The storm broke on Thursday morning. The road over the cliff drained by noon. A car came from Salerno at 2 o'clock, and Tommaso Ferrara was placed in the back of it without drama, without struggle, without anything at all except the particular silence of a village watching one of its own be taken away. Marco stood in the lane and watched the car until it disappeared around the cliff face. He did not look relieved. He looked like a man who had expected to be the worst thing in his family and had been wrong. Lucia stood on the steps of the house with her arms crossed and her face closed, and if she felt anything, she had decided, in the way she decided everything, that it was not for the street to see. Padre Aureliano prayed for the dead and the living equally, which is the priest's particular burden. Silvio Cataldo went back to his boats. The rivalry of 40 years concluded in a way that brought him no satisfaction whatsoever, which is the way most old rivalries end. Giulia Romano took her notebook and her questions and her guilt, and she went back to Rome. She never published the story. Some doors, she understood at last, are not meant to be opened. Just recorded, just mourned. Porto Sereno went back to being small, which is what small villages do. The boats went out again the following Monday. The harbour wall held. The wine cellar dried out slowly over the course of a week, and someone, no one ever said who, left a candle burning on the shelf where the promissory note had been hidden. It was still burning, that candle, 3 months later, when De Luca drove back along the coast road on unrelated business and looked down at the village from the cliff above. He stopped the car and stood in the cold January air and looked at it for a long moment. A small cluster of white houses on a cliff. Fishing boats in a blue harbour. A church with a leaning bell tower. He thought about fathers and sons, which he found he was thinking about more often as he got older. He thought about the particular cruelty of men who take from those who cannot take back. He thought about the way Tommaso had slept. Then he got back in the car. The sea below was perfectly calm, perfectly indifferent, perfectly blue. It had drowned a man and kept his secret for one night and then gone on being the sea. That is the thing about water. It holds nothing. It forgets everything. It simply continues.